Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. There are two main things I want to talk about today. The first is the connection between high workload and standards in school, behaviour standards in school. And this connection is going to come via two steps. So I'll talk first about the connection between workload and break times or social times. All three steps actually, if we're going to be thorough. Okay, first the connection between workload and break times, then between break times and detentions, and then between detentions and standards. So a connection in three steps, let's go. So teaching is a high workload profession. And what effect might this have on how teachers use or think about their break times? Well, I think it could have one of two effects, but either way it heads in the same direction. So first, when the workload's high, teachers might find themselves working through break and lunch times in order to get through it all so that they can perhaps leave at a reasonable time at the end of the day. Or because the workload is high, teachers might take break times completely off, use them to actually have a break. Bizarre though that may sound to some. Okay, so when workload is high, teachers may either work through break or they might really value having a break at break time. Now, what effect is this likely to have on detentions? Now, detentions in my school, and I think probably in many schools, entail a loss of social time for the student. Now, it just so happens that students' break times or social times are at the same time as teachers' break times. So if a teacher is going to issue and administer a detention for a student, then they're going to lose out on some, maybe all, of their break time because they're going to have to supervise this student as they carry out their detention. Okay, but because of the high workload that we mentioned a moment ago, a teacher may want to work through their break time, or they might want to just have a bit of a rest. Either way, that might make them less likely to issue detentions in lessons because they haven't got the time or the capacity or the will to supervise the students during break or lunchtime. And I might add that often the sorts of students who get detentions, not always, but often the sorts of students who get detentions, it can be quite tiring emotionally to supervise them. Often they'll want to talk, even argue about why they had the detention, and then all of a sudden your break or lunchtime, when you're trying to administer this detention, has become more stressful than the lessons themselves, because you've been stuck in this vicious circle of a conversation with a student, trying to get them to see the error of their ways and making very little progress. Now, that's not all students, but it's certainly some students. Okay, now what happens if, as a result of this, teachers are less likely to issue detentions in their lessons because they do want to protect their own break times, and rightly so. Now, if they are less likely to issue detentions in lessons, then this will entail, I think, a lowering of standards. So if you lower your standards, then students will be perhaps more likely to meet those standards and therefore less likely to need a detention. Although I will say, as I've discussed in previous episodes of the podcast, there is this salami slicing tactics that students intuitively use, expertly at times. So if you lower your standards a bit, then they'll lower their own behaviour in response a little bit more, and then all of a sudden you've lowered your standards a little bit again. So it's not sustainable. But anyway, this was a meandering connection here, but let's just summarise what I've said so far. So I think there might be a connection between workload and behavioural standards in school, and the connection proceeds in 2 or 3 steps. So if workload is high, that's going to make teachers value their break times more, and if teachers value their break times more, they're going to be less likely to want to supervise students during detentions. And if they're less likely to want to supervise students during detentions, then they're going to be less likely to issue those detentions in the first place, which will entail a reduction in standards or a lowering of behavioural standards in their lessons. So yeah, there are several steps in that chain, but I think each of them is fairly plausible. So I do think that there is this connection between workload and standards, in particular between a high workload and perhaps lower standards. So what can you do? What can you do to break this chain? Because I do think it's a problem. Now, you could perhaps, let's start at the start. You could perhaps try reducing teachers' workloads. I think that there are lots of clever strategies that one can use to streamline teachers' workloads, but at the end of the day, it is an inherently high workload profession, especially emotionally speaking. So that might be a non-starter. Second, you could pay teachers more. So I think there's such a thing as objective workload, the amount of work that you actually have to get done. And then there is also how you perceive that workload and how heavy it feels to you. And I think that part of what affects how we perceive our workload is how much we're being paid. So if I suddenly had a £10,000 pay increase as of next week, but my workload remained the same, I'm probably likely to experience my workload as being not quite as heavy anymore, because I feel I'm being adequately remunerated. So if we can't lower workloads, then perhaps we could pay teachers more. And of course, that is an ongoing debate and argument. But let's just say there aren't going to be any sudden big increases in teacher pay just for the time being. Okay, so another non-starter then. So what was the first step in the chain? It was from workload to valuing break times. Yeah. And then from valuing break times to being less likely to issue detentions. Okay, so perhaps what if detentions didn't coincide with teacher break times? Now, I think this was the case when I was at school. If you had a detention, you didn't sit with the teacher who gave you the detention. You went to a special room where everyone who had a detention sat in silence, and it was supervised by teachers who I must presume were members of SLT. And that was it. You didn't see the teacher who gave you the detention. So that would free up teacher break times and perhaps solve the problem, but at this point you have to ask, what is the point of a detention? Now I think, and I've learnt this from colleagues, I think that the point of a detention is to have a conversation about what went wrong and to figure out the steps that need to be taken in order for it not to go wrong again. So I think that a detention is only as good as its conversation. Okay, so I'll return to that in a minute. I also think that thinking about the connection between detentions and standards, I think that if you're relying on the threat of losing social times as a way to enforce standards, that might be a bit misguided. I'm not sure whether that's a good way to keep high standards in schools. I haven't seen any research to suggest that losing social time is a good way to improve student behaviour or to encourage students to improve their behaviour. Although I have read in several places that the way in which young people, children, learn to regulate their behaviour is by spending time with their peers. So after about the age of 3 or 4, the main driver of development among children and young people is not adults, but their peers. And the same goes for regulation. So suppose you've got some student who's incredibly dysregulated, gets into all sorts of trouble, and as a result, they barely ever have any time with their peers because they're always in detention at break and lunchtime. Well, this is going to be a reinforcing downward spiral for this student. Because if they're dysregulated, something that they ought to be doing is spending more time with their peers, doing more socialising, not less. It's by spending more time with their peers that they will learn, hopefully, to regulate themselves. So yes, I don't think that the threat of losing social time is a good way to enforce or uphold standards, behavioural standards at schools. Like I said a moment ago, I think that a detention, it's not about losing social time, it's about having a conversation. So what I've been doing recently, because I think I'm one of these teachers who does suffer from this problem where high workload could potentially lead to a lowering of standards via the connections that I discussed a moment ago. So what I've been doing recently to try and uphold standards, but at the same time protect my own social time, and in light of this realisation that detentions really are about conversations, they're not about punishing children by taking away their social time. So what I've been doing is if a student gets a detention, it gets logged on the system as a detention. They get the corresponding behaviour points and all that. But then the detention lasts only as long as the conversation. So I speak to students. I talk about what went wrong. We speak about the steps that the students and me need to take. We talk about what needs to happen next in order for that not to go wrong again, hopefully. And we end on positive terms. And that's it. Once that conversation is done, the detention ends. I see no point in making them sit in a room on their own for another 10, 15 minutes, even half an hour if it's at lunchtime. I see no point of doing that. I don't think it benefits them, and it certainly doesn't benefit me having to supervise them. So there you go. Some meandering thoughts about the connection between workload and standards in schools, in particular between high workload and potentially lower standards in schools, and how that connection could be broken by changing the way in which we think about detentions. It's not about taking students' socialising time away from them. In fact, that could be counterproductive. A detention is instead about the quality of the conversation. And once the conversation's been had, what's the point in keeping the student any longer? Okay, I have one other thing that I'd like to discuss today. First, my usual Patreon plea. This episode took a couple of hours to produce, and that's about average, and I aim to produce a couple of episodes a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so that's £2 to £3, once a month, then please consider signing up on Patreon and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution would be greatly appreciated. And if you sign up on the Patreon, you'll also gain exclusive early access to unedited videos of my recording sessions. So if you'd be interested in seeing those, then please do sign up on the Patreon. Thank you very much. Okay, now, this is a podcast with an ongoing focus on mental health, and so I'm now going to talk about mental health. I'm going to read you an entry from my reflections on a day. It wasn't last week, I think it was the week before, towards the end of the week before. I'll omit certain parts, but I'll read you most of it so you can get the idea. Oh, and just a reminder as well, this is part of my process for making the podcast. I make reflections at the end of each day. I don't do my reflections just because I'm making a podcast, maybe not even primarily. I do my reflections because I like to think about what's happened that day. I think it increases the chances that I'm actually going to learn from what's happened that day if I just give myself a moment to think about it. I think it is also cathartic, writing about what's happened. It can make you feel a bit better if you've had a bad day. I think there are lots of good reasons to write reflections, but yes, for me, one of them, it's part of my podcast process. So I write my reflections at the end of each day, and at the end of 2 weeks, I look back at my reflections and decide what I'm going to talk about on the podcast. Anyway, so this was the 15th of October, and my reflections went like this. Today, I don't want to be a teacher. I'm struggling to brush off rudeness and disrespect, and becoming enraged, but bottling it up, and that makes me feel unwell. We spoke about county lines during tutor period. I kicked a student out for being rude and for whistling. I then taught my year 9s about averages and range. The lesson was okay, but it was a bit boring. I went through a homework paper with year 11. Stem and leaf diagrams with my year 9s. A C4 for one student after talking, disruption, whistling, and lying. A C4, by the way, means a kicking out. I can't stand lying. I planned during my free. Then, probability trees with my year 10 class. Detentions for so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so-and-so. And I kicked so-and-so out, all for the sake of a wet wipe. And I felt awful afterwards. Again, I don't want to be a teacher anymore. So, that was very negative. That was a bad day. One of my worst days, I would say, in terms of just how I feel. And I did a lot of thinking afterwards about why I felt so bad. And on reflection, there was some bad behaviour that day, but it was no worse than it's been in the past, yet I felt much worse. So it wasn't really anything to do with the students, it was more something to do with me. And what I'd found was that I think that first sentence really summed it up. I'm struggling to brush off rudeness and disrespect and becoming enraged and bottling it up, which makes me feel unwell. I don't know why, but the little things that I would usually brush off, I just couldn't. And I don't know why. So there's lots of low-level misbehaviour that I address and move on normally. Don't really give it a second thought. But on this day and a few days around that day, I was dwelling on it, and it was getting to me on a personal level, and I was getting so angry, so angry. Like it's the first time as a teacher that I could feel my blood boiling. And of course, you can't act on those emotions. You can't start screaming or throwing things around. You can't walk out, stomp out, slam the door. You can't do these things because teachers are professionals. I'm a professional and I'll conduct myself accordingly. So you have to bottle it up. You hold it inside. In the moment, there's nowhere else that it can go. So you hold it in, and holding that sort of emotion in creates an awful amount of internal tension and stress. And like I said, had made me feel quite unwell. But again, I don't think it was anything that the students had done. They weren't especially bad, but I was reacting to it in this really negative way. And I don't really know why. I think it was probably just something to do with the fact that we were coming to the end of an 8-week term. I was really tired, and we are more sensitive to negative emotions when we're tired. So that's probably it. That's the most simple explanation, and it's probably the correct explanation. The first sentence of my reflections for the following day say, much better day today. I was feeling much more chilled. And on that point of feeling much more chilled, I think that this is an attitude that you can cultivate. It's not just something that you are by default or something that happens to you, feeling chilled. It's something that with a little effort, you can be or become more chilled. And I think that that is a better attitude to have generally as a teacher than someone who takes every little slight as a deeply personal offence, as I had done on the day before, and becomes incredibly angry and ends up making themselves feel quite unwell. And it was around this time that I also came upon a poem by Aldous Huxley, most famous, as you know, for writing Brave New World. But I came upon this poem, and it seemed to summarise exactly how I felt at this point. It's amazing how you seem to spot these things just at the right time. Anyway, here it is, I'll read it to you. It's dark because you are trying too hard. Lightly, child, lightly. Learn to do everything lightly. Yes, feel lightly, even though you're feeling deeply. Just lightly let things happen and lightly cope with them. So throw away your baggage and go forward. There are quicksands all about you, sucking at your feet, trying to suck you down into fear and self-pity and despair. That's why you must walk so lightly, lightly, my darling. And I'll end on that. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will talk again soon. In 3 weeks or so. It's half term now, so I'll have a break over half term, and then it'll be 2 weeks until I next record an episode, so I hope you enjoy your break too. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at MrBrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/MrBrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.